Hilchos Shmittah v'Yovel Perek Achad Asar, the laws of the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, chapter 11. Yesterday we introduced the concept of the Yovel year. Every 50 years is a special Jubilee year. The Rambam told us the basic things that happen during Yovel. It's like Shmittah in respect to not working the land. And additionally, all slaves go free, and all real estate that was sold during those 50 years reverts back to its original owner. That is going to be the topic of today's chapter, the details of that. Which real estate goes back? How does it go back? Is there a minimum, a maximum? Is there a way to bypass this rule? All the different halachas relating to it. So the Rambam begins by explaining the following halacha. It's kind of like not directly related to Yovel, but it brings out the point. Halacha Aleph, Eretz Yisrael hamischalekes lishvatim, every part of Israel that was divided to the tribes, because there was one city that wasn't divided. Yerushalayim is not owned by any tribe. So the Rambam is referring to everything outside of Yerushalayim. So that land, eino nimkeres litzmisus, can never be sold perpetually, for eternity. Shenemar, because it clearly says in the pasuk, v'ha'aretz lo yisimacher litzmisus, the land shall not be sold for eternity. V'imacher litzmisus, if somebody draws up a sale contract and he sells a piece of land in perpetuity, shneim oivrin b'leisaseh, both the seller and the buyer transgress a negative commandment. Ve'ein ma'asein ma'ilin, and their actions are worthless. Elo tachzer hasada libaleha b'yovel. Here's the connection. Rather, what happens in a sale, the field always goes back to its owner in the Yovel and the Jubilee year. Halacha beis v'hamoicher sadeo l'shishim shana. If somebody sells his field for 60 years, so he clearly says it's not forever, ein la yotze b'yovel. Then it doesn't go back by Yovel. She'ein chayzer b'yovel elo davar hanimker stamay hanimker litzmisus. Because the only real estate which goes back on Yovel is a land that was sold by default with no stipulation, or if it was sold forever. But the second you sell it for 60 years, even though Yovel is going to be in the middle of those 60 years, but since you yourself protected the eternal sale by saying it's going to be over in 60 years, so it's over in 60 years, not in Yovel. Halacha Gimel. Even if you sell land in Israel not for eternity, you have to have a good reason to sell it. Lo yimkar adam beisai oisdei achuzasai. A person should never sell his house or his ancestral field, afal pi sheim chayzer nachar zman, even though they're going to come back anyway after a time, Elohim kain ha'ani, unless he got poor. He has no other way to pay back his loans. Shenemar, because it says in the pasuk, v'chi yamuch achicha umachar me'achuzasai. Torah describes a sale as happening like this. When your brother gets poor and he sells part of his inheritance, in other words, the only reason to sell is if you get poor. Aval limkar ulahaniach hadamim bekisa. But just to sell and to put the money in your pocket, or to do business with them, or to buy household utensils, or slaves or an animal, not allowed. The only thing you can sell land for is to get food, simply to survive. If you transgressed and you sold it anyway, for a different reason, it's sold. The sale works, again, of course, not forever. It goes back by Yovel, but it works as a sale. Halacha Dalet. V'danin bebayis din batei arichayma, u'besade din sdei achuza. The court needs to rule when it comes to homes. They have to adjudicate the rules of homes in walled cities. That's tomorrow's topic. If you sell a house in a walled city, there's a special law that applies to it. And the courts also have to rule on fields, the laws relating to ancestral fields. What is that law? That's going to be today's chapter. Din meiches de achuzasai. The law of the person who sells his ancestral field is as follows: lechashev es hadamim lefi hashanim hanishares layovel. You calculate the worth based on the years that remain until Yovel. Essentially, every sale you look at as a long rental agreement, and the rights to owning it for each year is determined by dividing proportionally the amount of years that remain till Yovel, and that's how much each year's rights are worth. At any point, if the seller wants to get back his field, you calculate with the buyer for the years that he already consumed the field. Subtract that from the worth of the sale. Umachzer lehashar, and you give him back the rest. Ketzad. What does this mean? Take an example. Hare hanishar leyovel eser shanim. Umachar leisade b'mea dinar. There's 10 years left till the next yovel, and you sell a field for 100 coins. So what does that mean? Every year is worth 10 coins. Right? Because there's 10 years left, 100 coins, 100 divided by 10 is 10. Let's say the buyer uses the field for 3 years. He eats the produce of the field for 3 years. And now the seller doesn't want to wait for yovel. He wants to get his field back now. So give him back 70 coins, because he paid 10 coins per year.
What if he did improvement?
1 second. We'll see about improvements. Good question. By default, no improvements. He gives him 70 coins and returns the field. Same thing if he ate it for 6 years. Again, give him 40 coins, bring back the field. If the seller didn't want to buy it back, he simply left it with the buyer all the way until yovel, so he used up the full amount of the money that he paid for. At yovel, it goes back to the owners for no money, because that was it. Your rental time is used up. Shenemar, because it says in the verse, b'mispar shnei svuos yimkar lach. At the number of years of crops, that's how it should be sold to you. In other words, you sell a field proportional to how many years are left till the yovel. Halacha vav, machra loy v'himelea peris. Let's say you sold a field, and at the time of sale, it was full of fruit. It was an olive grove, okay? And all the olive trees were full. 2 years pass, and you want to buy it back. The seller cannot tell the buyer, I want to take it back full of fruit like I sold it to you. No. Whatever the buyer wants to do during those years, he gets to eat all the fruit. Let's say you would sell him this olive grove, full of trees, full of fruits, before Rosh Hashanah, and you end up buying it back after 2 years. You'll have a situation where the buyer is getting to eat 3 times in 2 years, because he buys it full, then he plants it again, and then he plants it again in the 2 years. But the calculation is only made at a rate of 2 years, because only 2 years passed, even if 3 crops were harvested. Shenemar, because the verse says, Al pi hashanim. It's in a different context, talking about consecrated field, but the same rules apply. Based on the years. Le'al pi atvois, not based on the crops. You go based on the years that passed, and the years that remain till yovel, that's all that matters. Halacha zayin, hakonim v'hazmoiros, upeiros shikma shebesoicha. Shoots, like reeds, vines, and the fruits of the sycamore tree, or some say shikma means a white fig, shebesoicha, that are in it. Harehin shalekeach kishara peiros shala. These belong to the buyer like any other fruit, because these young shoots and these young vines are actually partially edible. So they're not considered trees, they're considered fruit. Avol ilan shenichsach yavash. But if there's a tree in the field that got cut down or got dried up, shnei asurin bai. Both the buyer and the seller are forbidden to use it. The buyer cannot use it because it's not in the field anymore. The seller can't use it because he transferred the rights of everything to the field, to the seller, to the buyer. Keitzad yasa, what should be done? Yimacher. You sell this wood, this tree, the lakach bedam of karka, buy real estate with the worth. And the buyer can eat the fruit of that land as well, because it came as a result of his original field, until the field is bought back or returns by yovel. Halacha ches. Now comes your question about improvements. Halakeach sdei achuza. Somebody buys an ancestral field, unita ilanis, and the buyer, during the years that he owns it, plants trees in it, v'hishbicha, and now it's improved. So it's improved by direct result of actions that the buyer took. When the field goes back on yovel, and it does, the real estate goes back, but what do you do about the improvements? We have to estimate, we have to evaluate the worth of the improvements of the trees in it. And the owner of the field, the original owner, has to give the worth of those improvements to the buyer, because that's totally his, doesn't belong to the seller. Shenemar, because the verse says, V'yatza mimkar bayis. the house that was sold goes out by yovel. That means mimkar chayzer v'lei ashvach. Only the original item that was sold goes back, not the improvements. Halacha tes hamoicher esadeo bizman shayovel neik. K'moshe b'yarnu. If somebody sells a field during the time that yovel was observed, as we explained yesterday, that it wasn't always, right? Jews observed yovel only when most Jews lived in Israel. So if a person were to sell his field during those times, einoi mutar ligoil lepoches mishtei shanim. You aren't allowed to even buy it back less than 2 years. There has to be a minimum of 2 years. Shenemar, because it says, b'mispar shnei sevuos yimkar lach. Okay, highlighted the wrong words here. It should be these words here. B'mispar shnei sevuos yimkar lach. In a number of years of crops, in the plural, it should be sold to you. That means that there has to be years of crops, at least 2 years. V'afilu ratza halekeach aser. Even if the buyer wants to sell it back, forbidden. Shenemar, b'mispar shanim achar hayovel tikne me'esa misecha. In the number of years, again, plural, after yovel, you can buy it back from your friend. Ein paches mishtei shanim me'es le'es me'yem mechira. There can be no less than 2 years, 24 hours. In other words, literally from the day of sale, not Rosh Hashanah, from the day that you sold it. Halacha Yud, even in the 2 years, v'tzarich sheyochal halekeach shtei tvuos b'shtei shanim v'achar kach yigal. The buyer has to have eaten 2 crops during those 2 years, and only then can you buy it back. So 2 things have to happen: 2 years of time have to pass, but also 2 crops have to be harvested, naturally speaking. Shenemar, as it says, shnei sevuos, years of crops. Lefichach, therefore, im hoisa achas mishtei hashanim shvius. If one of the 2 years was Shmittah, when you couldn't work the land, oy shnas shidafain oy yerakain, it was a year of windblast or blight. Windblast and blight are 2 kinds of plagues that can harm crops, and nothing could grow. Eina oila min aminyan. That year doesn't count for the number of 2 years, because even if the guy would have tried to harvest his land, he wouldn't have been able to get any crops. On the other hand, if the guy made a choice, an active choice not to work the land, if the buyer left it fallow, unworked for a year, and eats it for a year, or he eats it for a year and just plows it the next year, doesn't plant it, those years do count. Because then it wasn't Hashem's fault or nature's fault, it was your fault. What if you left it both years fallow? The commentaries argue if that's enough to count it or not. But that's definitely 1 year. 1 year it counts. If you were to sell it in the year of Yovel itself, the sale doesn't even work. And the money just goes back to the original owner of the money. In other words, if Yovel can stop any previous sale, certainly it can stop a sale during that year. So basically you can't sell land during that 50th year. Yud Beis, Machra Shana Achas Lifnei HaYovel. If you sold it 1 year before Yovel, the commentaries say it can't really mean 1 year, because the year before Yovel is always Shmittah. But let's say 2 years before Yovel. So he ate it, he worked it for that 1 year. This is another case where Yovel won't work, because he hasn't had 2 years yet. So you have to keep it for 1 year after Yovel, and then he can buy it back. Shenemar Shnei Sevuos, again, years of crops. If there's no years of crops, you got to keep it till you get at least 2 years of 2 crops. Yud Gimel Machar Nekayim Leimayim Oislayim Sheinam Ru'yin Lizriya. If you had sold ditches full of water or rocky areas which couldn't be planted anyway, then you can redeem it less than 2 years in. Shenemar b'mispar shnei sevuos, because it says has to be a number of years of crops, which means sada hara'uya litvua hi she'eina nigelas ala achar shtei shanim. Only a field which can produce crops is the one that cannot be redeemed only after 2 years. But a rocky terrain or a watery place could be redeemed. If you didn't buy it back, even though it's not fit for planting, it's still under the rule of returning to the owner by yovel. So it has both sides on the catch. You can redeem it early, but it goes back by yovel. Halacha Yudalid Machar Ilonis. If a person only sold trees, fruit trees, Ein Nigalin Lepaches Mishtei Shanim, they also cannot be bought back less than 2 years in. Shari Ru'uyim Latvois, because they're fitting to have produce produced from them. On the other hand, though, if you didn't buy them back, Einon Chayzrin Labailin Bayovel. They don't go back to the owners. On Yovel, Shenemar V'shavla Achuzasai. The seller goes back to his estate. He goes back to estate, not to trees. Tezvav Machar Sadehu Larishain. You sold your field to one guy. V'rishain Machar L'Sheni, V'sheni L'Shlishi, Afilu mea zeh achar zeh. First guy sells it to the second guy, sells it to a third guy, even to 100 guys. Bishnas hayovel tachzer la'adin harishon. When yovel year comes, it goes all the way back to the original owner. Shenemar bishnas hayovel, it says clearly, in the year of yovel, Yashuv hasadeh la'asher kanohu me'itai. Okay, I don't see this on the screen here. My bad. In the year of yovel, the field should go back to the person he bought it from, la'asher loy achuzas ha'aretz, to whom the estate of the land was. In other words, it goes all the way back to the original owner. But what happens if the price changed during these sales? Machra l'rishen b'mea dinar, v'rishen l'sheni b'masayim. What if the seller sold it to Mr. A for 100 coins? Mr. A sells it to Mr. B for 200 coins. V'ratza ha'adin ligo. Now the original owner wants to buy it back. If he goes to the second seller, they're going to say, hey, I paid 200 for this, you should pay me 200. Says the Rambam, Einem mechashev elohim arishen. No, you only go to the first guy. Hey, I sold it to you for 100, I want it back for 100.
What if he doesn't want to sell it to you?
Huh?
What if he doesn't want to sell it back?
It's too bad.
He has to sell it back to
Yep. Because it's considered rental in essence. It's not really considered yours ever. Shenemar lo ish asher machar loy. Because it says, here it is, you go back to the person which you sold it to. Machar l'rishen b'masayim, v'rishen l'sheni b'meya. Okay, so if you always go after the first person, what if it's the opposite case? You sold it first for 200, and that guy sells it for 100. So this would turn out to be a stringency, because if you go to the first guy, you'll have to pay 200 now. Says the Rambam, no, we also go leniently. Now you can go to the second guy and get it for only 100. We always go lenient for the seller. Same thing if, forget there was no second person that bought it. There's one seller, one buyer. You sell it for 100, and then it goes up in price, not because of improvements that the buyer made, just market price. Real estate goes up, and now it's allowed to be bought for 200. We're lenient. We go based on what the sale price was, and he only pays 100. Something in the opposite. You sold it for 200 originally, now the real estate goes down, again, market-wise, not because of your laziness, and now it's only fitting to be sold for 100. I mean, for sure, if it's your laziness, but even market price. Again, we're lenient, and we give the seller the price based on what it is now, only 100. Always, we elevate the power of the seller, and we diminish the power of the buyer. A person sells a field, but he also owns other fields. So he has field 1 that he sold, and he has field 2, he now sells that field to get cash to buy back the other field. Ein shayman, we don't listen to him. Shanemar, because it says, he needs to find, he needs to come up with the money worth to redeem his field. He has to find something new which wasn't found by him when he sold it, the field he already had. Something you took out a loan. You borrowed money to be able to buy back your field. Ein shayman, we don't listen to him. Shenemar, because it says, his own hand has to afford it, not by taking a loan. Let's say he made some more money, a little bit of money, and now he can redeem half the field. Ein shayman, we don't listen to him. Shenemar, because it says, kedei geulasai. You have to have enough for the redemption. Oy goyel es kula, oy ein goyel. The goyel. It's your name. Either you redeem it all, or you don't redeem it all. If the relatives want to buy it back for you, goyelim, they can buy it back. Shenemar uva goyaloi hakarev elav. The goyel, the relative who's related to him, can come and redeem it for him. If somebody gifts his field, it goes back in the Jubilee year. Gifts are not forever either. There's an extra verse which says, in the Yovel year you go back to your estate. This includes even the gift. Chaf, look how far the laws of Yovel go. If brothers divide an estate, 2 brothers inherit a father, they divide an estate, they are considered to be buyers from each other. And by Yovel, they have to put back into the pot. The division ends by Yovel. Now, The Rambam clarifies, "V'loiti batel chalukasan mikamais shahaisa." There's no need to actively nullify the division the way it was. Rather, as the commentators explain, just switch portions. In order to show that you don't own this property forever, after 50 years, switch the portions. Of course, if there was improvements that either one made, they have to pay each other back for that. But the point is the land on its own should be switched. So to a firstborn who took double portion from his father's estate, or a person who does yibum, that means his brother passed away, he marries the wife, and he takes the estate of the brother. You simply return on yovel the part that you took, take another portion opposite. In other words, you got to do a switcheroo at some point during the yovel to show that you're not actively owning something forever. But if somebody inherits his own wife, even though the whole idea of inheriting a wife is rabbinic, the sages gave strength to their words, like biblical words, and you don't have to return it on yovel. Or if you're the sole inheritor, if you have no brothers, and you inherit your father, there's no going back to anybody. It's just yours. Same thing if you inherit your wife, it goes back to you. No need to give it back to your wife's family on yovel. One exception. If you inherited from her a family cemetery, this was very common in those days. Today we have one big Jewish cemetery, but it used to be that they would put all their family members in one plot. So if you inherited that, that you should give back to your wife's family, mishum pigam mishpacha, because of the blemish of the family. It's embarrassing if family members cannot bury their new family members in the family plot, because the husband's holding on to them. So give them back to the cemetery. They should pay him back for it. He has to subtract the worth of his wife's grave, because he's obligated to do that. But whatever else the rest of the family plot is worth, let them pay him back, and he gives it back to them on yovel.